So it looks like we have a thin agenda here and probably mostly reliant on where Stephen's at.
Exactly. I know, poor Stephen.
I think it's poor Stephen, but probably mostly poor Michael, since I think Michael's been doing a lot of the work on this.
Okay, that's okay. For a good cause.
This is a voluntold situation.
I'm here to serve, you know, like I'm one of those people who's like, okay, sure, let's do it. And this particular one, I actually hadn't been to the old State House probably since like a field trip in grade school or something like that. So to be able to, you know, attend this meeting and the way it was run and everything, it was super cool. I got to review the video afterward. Very, very, very nice to, and a very special privilege to be part of this work. So I thank you all.
So we were at the National Association of Secretaries of State conference last week. And the America 250 only came up briefly at one point, and we were kind of surprised, the deputy and I were talking, we were kind of surprised that it wasn't a bit more of a focus or a topic in one of our sessions that's devoted to, you know, communications or outreach. So trying to think, maybe there's a way, you know, they meet twice a year and as a group, as a conference. So I'm wondering if we can somehow get that on the agenda for future. I mean, it's just great to like see what other states are doing, and definitely sounded like, you know, New Jersey talked a bit about, you know, they've been kind of working on this for a while, but other states definitely didn't even really know much. So we're all kind of in a different spot.
You know, Ariane, Cindy and I met last week to sort of talk a little bit about how do we increase public engagement with the 250th work. And, you know, one of the concerns we had is when we had these info sessions, the public that attended was, generally speaking, older and whiter. And we sort of reflected on the work that you and Stephanie are doing in terms of voter engagement, civic engagement, and education. And I think that that's an area that we really need to be attentive to. So we had talked about reaching out to you in the Secretary of State's office to figure out, we've talked about this, but how do we take this to the next level and ensure that, you know, we're really directing our energy as much to the future as we are to the past. And I think that's going to be a really important part of the work that we do with the commission.
Yeah,
That's right.
Sorry.
No, I was just agreeing. That's great.
Yeah, because I was looking at something you guys recently sent out. There was some type of guide. Maybe it came from New York, a writer in New York, but it was a guide, kind of how to start your commission and some tips in there. And it really did sound very much like a perspective of looking just at the historical piece of 250 and not necessarily kind of projecting how do we take this and move it forward. And I did think that that was a little bit more of what we were, you know, what Connecticut was trying to do. So yeah, I think that we would definitely love to talk with you guys about that piece. And I do think, you know, a lot of our experience so far, I mean, we've only had 6 months on the job, but, you know, we really dove right into that area of our work. And so we can definitely, I think we have a lot we can share around that.
It's great.
You know, there's if I may, hi everybody, it's Steve Hernandez, and I'm sorry if I'm missing a punchline, but you know, in terms of the look back and the look forward, in a lot of ways, our founding documents, at least the humanities documents of a few decades ago, were really interesting in that written into them was a celebration of what we got, right? What we have, and all of the ways in which everything we are informs what we've got. And for me, that was a reaffirmation. You know, the very founding was a forward-looking act. The founding itself wasn't about memorializing the past. It was about creating a bond that was going to take us into the future. And what we've been doing ever since is making that bond stronger, testing it at times, and meaningfully testing it in a way that I think, you know, is part of what we do every time we celebrate a birthday, right? It's been a great year, but next year is going to be better. And I think for us, you know, in terms of what it is that we're doing with this birthday of the country is, yeah, it's been a trying year. It's been a good year. We've had great moments, but next 100 years are going to be better. And here's why. And that's what's really exciting, I think, about what we can model as organizations. And ultimately why I think, you know, having a set of guiding documents that help us have these conversations and perhaps a series of conversations along the way is so critically important. And so anyway, I don't know if that's what you were talking about, but that's what you stoked in my mind when I was able to pop in.
Yeah. I was thinking exactly that in terms of what will the local entities need to get started, and you know, some document that allows them to brainstorm or asks really like probing questions about you know, that will just lead them to figure out the best type of project even to consider. So like
That's really
beyond the
great.
themes, but like something that they can use to actually like develop their ideas. I think that's
really neat.
probably like the best starting point for them.
You know, I think I love that the guiding document, how to join the party, right? And what's really cool is that there are a lot of different ways to do that and a lot of different reasons to do it. And so think of one reason. I mean, it's no mystery why DECD is one of our partners, right? Because in a lot of ways, in telling your story as a democracy, you're going to attract attention, right? And attention can be very good attention. It can be like, you know what, I'd love to go see that place. I'd love to learn more about those people. I'd love to understand more about that occurrence. And what's really neat is that's an opportunity for learning from each other, but also, hey, it's a tourism opportunity. You know, and you know, what's really cool is that, you know, I'll give you a very, very modest example. There's an area of the state capitol that's pretty much off limits to the public, right? It's like this, it's the dome, the inside of the gilded dome of the Capitol. And can you imagine, right? Because we're talking about accessibility, access, about being able to see the nooks and crannies of our state, some of which are hundreds of years old. Can you imagine if part of the partnership, a project, was to have virtual access, right? That was almost like a virtual reality access of our great spaces and places, making it accessible not only to all the people of the state, but to people all over the world, right? And so if somebody wanted to see the inner workings of the dome, of the gilded dome of the state, they could do that virtually. Or if a kid who didn't have access and wanted to imagine themselves there, you know, they could do that virtually, whether they're down the street or they're across the country. And, you know, that's part of the ideas that we could help put seedlings around for, you know, through that document, that guidance document that you're describing.
That's such a great idea. And like utilizing that type of technology, showing that already is kind of forward thinking, or at least, you know, present day thinking. I love that idea.
I mean, talk about radical inclusion, right?
Yeah, that's really great, Stephen. I'm thinking, you know, with the bylaws, you know, we've talked about, you know, sort of structuring it in a way that is a model around the social contract and sort of building that relationship. But I wonder if we can embed in, I think you used a phrase earlier, the promise to America, when you were talking about the responsibility of NEH and so on. But, you know, this could be our promise to Connecticut. And what is that bond, you know, as we're imagining the future?
I love that. You know, and maybe part of that, if we could give any prompting to our friend, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
If we could give any prompting to our friend David Adams, you know, maybe what he can talk about is how it is that we not only recommit to each other in our constitutional republic, but also how we recommit to each other as a democracy here in Connecticut. And maybe he can speak to both of those things. You know, as I said before, he's I don't know if we were going to talk about that as well, but I saw it on the agenda and I'm just kind of benchmarking that. But, you know, he's fluent in both of those ideas as both a person who is a soldier, but also a person who runs an organization deeply committed to democracy, to civics, and to social and emotional skills building. Kind of the relational work.
Yeah. Well, we've definitely touched on all three parts of the agenda, but
I know, exactly.
maybe not in the order or structure that we hoped. So I'm wondering, where do we go from here?
So Michael shared with me a draft of the bylaws. So I can share the screen and also put it in the chat so that you can either look on your own screen or we can all look at it together. I'm sorry, I have way too many windows open. One moment. Yes, that's the right one.
Sending a request for access, Cindy. Oh,
No, so.
okay.
Can everybody see it on the screen as well?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm happy to share, but Michael, if you want to talk people through.
Steve, before I begin, did you have any other framing comments you would like to say?
No, why don't we start with just sort of what you found, Michael, and why it is that you've composed this initial composition in the way that you have, and then we can talk about, we can go back to some of the things that were mentioned earlier about how we could possibly use the bylaws as also a vision document for the work.
Yes. Okay, very good. Thank you. And briefly to introduce myself, as is my first meeting of this governance subcommittee, my name is Michael Warner. I'm the lead aging policy analyst for the Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity. And as I said earlier at the start of the meeting, I'm very excited to be able to help participate in this project. What we have before us is a very, very preliminary draft of bylaws. It is borrowed heavily from Maryland. However, I did print out and read also from Vermont and Rhode Island. And this document is also infused with Connecticut's Executive Order 22-2, which has been placed in here. So what I wanted to do was have something that broadly covered everything, with the understanding that this is a longer term project. It's essentially a 5-year project concluding in June of 2028, and that it would be helpful for us to have these bylaws to help guide us going forward in this purpose. So as we see, there's the opening section. And, I'm not sure if folks will want to jump in or if we can, briefly review it and then folks can maybe take a few days afterward. And if they have things they want to add to it, we can perhaps, Cindy and I can keep in touch too. We can harmonize other people's updates before we share it with the rest of the commission as a whole. But I wanted to structurally have here, like I said, with Maryland, they had a complete document. They've been working on this project since 2021 with their executive order. And we can, briefly walk through it. So on this first page that Cindy has on the screen, we have in a brief statement about these bylaws, where they come from. We have the purpose to recognize Connecticut's unique role. I use the phrase here, we can change it if we want, but it's a historical phrase of nutmeggers to refer to folks from Connecticut discreetly. And it talks about the termination date. The second article of it discusses membership. So this particular section is right out of the 22-2 executive order, which discusses the actual appointees, starting with the governor and his designee, and works his way through his executive branch folks, and up until the last person on the section A9, up to 6 people. Actually, bear with me 1 minute. That last one is left over. I meant to start. It's actually up to 3 people, I believe.
I was gonna say, I think it's these 4 are not in the executive order that I'm highlighting
So
right now.
maybe we can strike those through, but there is a last, the Connecticut one, up to 3 members of the public appointed by the governor. So we can sure to update this. Maybe we can update together and have a more accurate version. So there's that. Then section B talks about the folks who are invited to join, and those are those include us. They are listed here throughout, all the way through a student or youth leader recommended by the executive director, which I thought was kind of a neat addition to put in there for age diversity as well. Are there any questions so far? No. Okay.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I thought so too. So moving on, and I found this to be fairly common, compensation. No one's getting paid. Some other states had language about mileage and things like that, but I didn't see that in the executive order or anywhere else that I've come across yet. There are a lot of materials that I referenced from our vault so far, which I'll get into a little bit later. But I just kept that plain. No one's going to receive any compensation. Ethics, right, again, out of the executive order. Transparency, Freedom of Information Act, as stated in the order. The role of the chair and the vice chair, both of those are appointed by the governor. And the duties of the commission, referencing sections 7 and 8 of our executive order, and they are enumerated below in section A right there. Duties of the commission shall consist of the following. And again, those are all right out of the executive order. Any questions on this?
So I have one question, just in terms of the staff, because that is one area where we're working. I guess my first question, did you receive the MOU that we drafted between DECD and Connecticut Humanities?
I saw that it was in there. When I was putting this together, after I received my logins at the end of last week, I did review from that. So, but that's a great catch, Cindy, because that's what I need y'all's help with, to be able to incorporate whatever's not there.
Yeah, so there's some language in there about the relationship between CTH staff and DECD staff. Because it really is mostly CTH staff that is doing the work.
Right,
Is there another-
I used that executive order. I also saw the American Battlefield Group. But I didn't hear their name. That's in the executive order too. I didn't cite them, but on the executive order, it says, whereas the commission will coordinate, engage, and liaise with the US version and other local, county, state commissions, as well as private, public organization partners, including but not limited to the America 250 Foundation and the American Battlefield Trust. I didn't come across that term in any of the other 250 Connecticut 250 documents I saw. I didn't mention them specifically, but they're also in there.
I have not noticed it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't in there, so can take a look at what they're doing and,
Yeah, Cindy, let's flag that for follow-up.
yeah.
I suspect anything in the MOU, I'm not, this is premature, I think, for the rest of this document, Michael. But I'm not sure anything in the MOU would necessarily fall in this section, since this is specifically outlined, as you point out, by the governor's executive order.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It also makes sense to be, inclusive of it, given whenever it gets ratified and that the CT Humanities are already on board with their staffing. So I'm not opposed to expanding the language to incorporate their participation, since it'll be tremendous.
Great.
So yeah, so the rest of the article is the second article is essentially right out of the governor's executive order. Moving to article, are there any other questions on that portion? And maybe Cindy and I too, you can give a fresh pair of eyes to, and we'll make sure that there's no typos or any of that other stuff, that it's totally accurate without typos or anything. But moving on to the Article 3 about meetings. A lot of this language is a little bit hybrid. It's a little bit of the Maryland language, because they had very similar, a lot of the states had similar, time and place determined by the chair. You can do telephonically, you can do video conferencing. They don't say Zoom, they don't give brands. But I went in and made sure that they referenced the correct Connecticut versions. For example, section 1225 of the Connecticut General Statutes in regards to open meetings. And, there's certain things in here about notice that I wasn't 100% sure on, if we had made certain decisions about 7 days or 24 hours, but I wanted to have some placeholder language in there for folks to be able to deliberate upon.
I will update that. I have a list of, in terms of FOIA requirements for what and I believe that what we've been trying to stick to is 7 days for listing the meeting and 1 business day for sharing the agenda.
Okay, that sounds good to me. So, one of the areas that, we just talked about public notice in section 3, section 4, quorum. This language is also borrowed from Maryland. It felt applicable. I didn't, if someone wants to change something out, I don't know if there's any additional information about quorums, if we had something from the MOU that delineated any of that, or if it's just a simple majority will be sufficient. I will say that there was some language that I just took out. I wasn't sure if we needed it regarding removal. Ironically, I removed it. But if that's something that we want, we can put that back in. There's some template language about removing folks as well. Any discussion on that?
That's actually an interesting point, both in terms of removal, but also replacement. Like if people move on, their roles change, like what is the process for replacing somebody?
5 years is a long time.
Yeah, and some of them were appointed by particular roles, like Doug Lord, who is the president of the Connecticut Library Association.
And actually,
That's-
he's not the president anymore, which,
Exactly.
yeah,
Proves
So
the
he
point.
cycles off, then the next person, so it's an annual role. So we could have
Right.
5 people in that role.
he's still serving as immediate past president. So he is still on the board of CLA for this year.
Although I guess if it's defined by the role, the person can change, and that is stated, but
Well, it is defined in the executive order as a representative of CLA, not necessarily by the role. So
Okay.
we determined what that meant during the appointments. Or the governor's office or whoever it was.
okay.
And just to be clear to say it, there was a couple other enumerated clauses that we can go back to, we can put in. This is all in the Maryland one for folks who want to just open the Maryland one too and do it side by side. But there was a section on non-voting members. There was a section on vacancies. There was a section on attendance and removal. That was section 5 of Article 2B. And that talks about attendance removal. If they fail to meet 50% during 12 months, then they can be removed. There was also a conflict of interest section in there. But given that we've already cited to Connecticut ethics laws and freedom of information laws, I didn't know if that would be considered redundant or not. I'm happy to defer to whomever else if we want to make these really comprehensive. We can put those back in, and folks can view what that looks like right in the Maryland document. Any thoughts on that?
Might need to sit on that for a little bit. I'm not sure how granular we want to get. I mean, Denise might want to weigh in on this at some point too. Is the chair. I don't know. I mean, if we don't include that granularity, does that subject us to any concern? Will this prevent us from good governance if we don't spell this stuff out?
We can put a line, members shall serve at the pleasure of the chair, or at the pleasure of the governor, and that might take care of it.
I think some of this is implied by the executive order. So, for instance, while we can have a process of refilling a seat with a representative from an organization, we cannot have a process that would remove an organization. That would have to be something that would be done by a revised executive order. And then in terms of the compliance stuff, I think that there are some minimum requirements for what should be in bylaws according to Connecticut law. So we'll just have to make sure that any conflict of interest provision or that the notice provisions are accurate and any ethics provisions comport with what those minimum requirements are.
And to add to that, Steve, just to reflect in Maryland, in their group of invited people, it includes 2 members appointed by the president of the Maryland Senate and the Speaker of the Maryland House. And then it goes on to say they're non-voting members. So if there's some legislators who want to serve, they shall serve as non-voting members of the commission and fall under that. I don't know if down the road, I mean, it's a couple of years out, if there could be a number of legislators who want to be involved. The way Maryland is handling it is they're enumerated, you get 2 appointments, but they're non-voting. Ours that I saw the governor doesn't enumerate any specific legislators, or speaker gets 2 and Senate president gets 2. So that I didn't include that because they're not there, but that's just something for us to keep in mind. If we get some patriotic legislators who would like to participate, they can advise. But we
I-
will consent.
I thought that it was somewhere we had talked about, I don't remember whether the notion of the advisory was one that was in the executive order or one that was ideated by the co-chairs, but I think the advisory is a great space for different types of civically engaged participants to be involved. So maybe in creating a section in the bylaws that that allows for an advisory, and then just noting that members of the advisory are invited at the pleasure of the co-chairs or of the body, however it is you want to style it. And but they are non-voting. But they do A, B, C, and D. They inform A, B, C, and D, or they inform section 2. I think that would be really cool, because that way we can loop in community organizations, we can loop in legislators, anyone that was not not necessarily contemplated, because I think they were all contemplated, but not mentioned in the statute, in the executive order.
So the advisory council was mentioned in the executive order, but it was not detailed. So I think that sounds great. And Michael, maybe you and I can sit down and talk through this at some point, and I can share some other language that we've drafted that you can take or not take, whatever.
No,
Right.
so Michael has really helped us with this document. So it's really yours and ours to take. And Michael's being a steward. He's both as a person who's gone to law school, he was been very helpful to me in just helping think of these things from that perspective. But also, from the perspective of his livable communities work. So the livable communities work is that inclusive community imagining, multi-generational, cross-generation livability that so many of our towns are really committed to. And it just resonates so nicely. So that's why Mike is helping us, but it's really for us. And so I want us to feel like we all own this document.
I agree with that.
Sounds
And
great.
if you wouldn't mind just scrolling up slightly to the bottom of page 3, a little bit further, number 8. Establish an advisory council or other such duty as deemed necessary, composed of citizens at large who have knowledge and history and interest in its semi-quincentennial celebration to assist the commission in its work. So that's right out of section 7H of the executive order with the governor's language. So that's where the advisory council is mentioned, and that's where I think the chair has the ability to appoint non-voting advisors from the public, and perhaps legislators can come from that pool as well.
I think that's a pretty good catch-all section that we could do that.
That's great.
In section 5 of Article 3 under the meetings, talks right there about voting at a meeting, non-voting members. And so those advisory people would be non-voting members, so they're covered in there as well.
The only question I have about this section is I know that Denise was hoping we would be able to vote via email. Is that, and it says here that there shall be no voting by proxy. Is that the same or?
So that's,
Okay,
so there's go ahead, you answer first and then I'll answer.
Right, voting by proxy means that you send someone to vote in your name.
okay.
But voting may be conducted via telephone conference calls or online video conference calls. Online video conference calls will include Teams and Zooms, and telephone conference calls will include telephone, but neither one of these include email. And there are reasons that emails aren't included that are probably good governance, but I don't know if they're outdated now, considering.
Right, because that person's email could be maybe now subject to FOIA. Or if they go potentially, I don't know, maybe not, if they're using their private email, my Gmail, whatever, and not my work email, and I'm doing it. But yeah, the proxy voting would be separate and distinct from that, but we can certainly, the language covers it. I just don't think someone could vote on behalf of someone else, but
Let's look at the law, Michael, on if there's anything in Connecticut law that speaks to voting by email. And then I think because what's interesting is that I know that in the legislature, they are not allowed to vote by email. I happen to be on a board where on a couple of boards that allow voting by email, but on one of them, the vote has to be unanimous, which is interesting. And in the other one, it's a regular vote. So that's telling me that it is allowed. And then the question is, if we do allow it, to what extent, right? Do we allow it?
and at the legislature too, what they'll do sometimes is if there's a meeting and members miss that meeting, they'll say, okay, the vote is open until 2 p.m. And as long as that member calls the clerk and affirmatively or in the negative gives their vote, then that counts too. And we, I don't know if we want to say stuff like that or during a meeting, if there's a particular member not there, the vote will be open until 5 p.m., whatever. And if there's a quorum issue there, maybe that might resolve it. I don't know.
Here we go. So the quorum section really tells us a story here, because your presence is counted when you can participate in real time with all of the other participants. So if you're emailing, you can't do that. And that's probably a reason, at least for action taken at a meeting, to not count your email vote as a vote. Now, I think with email votes, it's all or nothing. Either everyone is voting by email or no one is voting by email. You can't have both because of the quorum requirement. And you might allow voting by email for special circumstances. For instance, to waive a waivable requirement, or to approve an emergency situation that has to be approved outside of a meeting. So maybe we can have a special, if you can find one, Michael, a special provision for voting by email for emergency or exigent circumstances.
Yeah, and I know too from my municipal experience that when you do vote by email, like you can't have any discussion either. Well, what about this? What about that? What about this? Because then it could become an illegal meeting if they're having this discussion outside of the public, so to speak, and it's not been posted at the right time and let notice and all of that stuff. But I think also there was, with COVID, a lot of rules became new rules too. So, see how that goes. So yeah, we talk about on here the duties of the chair and the vice chair. A lot of that language, once again, is it's borrowed from Maryland, but as I read it, to me, it felt aligned with our executive order. And again, I invite other folks to, whether it's now or whether it's, in a couple of days, look over it and highlight anything that might need updating. And so moving on to Article 4 for the committees. Now this one, there was a section I took out from Maryland. They had something called an executive committee. And I wasn't sure if that was something that we had enumerated, right? We had the main commission like we did last week, and then, there'll be subcommittees after. So I kept it in general, and then I talked about subcommittees, and then I went to one of the documents that was in our vault about the breakout for the different subcommittees, and I took that language right out of that document for folks to be able to reference. So I think it was, that should look familiar, right? That language, the I don't know if it was from the organizational chart.
It does. I will say we might have some changes in the coming weeks as the subcommittees, we had our first subcommittee meeting for this subcommittee in June, and the same was true for most of them. And so I think in particular, engagement and education might see some changes to the scope of their work based on the conversation at last week's commission meeting.
Want to be broader than K through 12 and more inclusive for other folks, which makes a lot of sense if we have folks from my constituency, older adults, very much interested too. That would be good to have accessible. And that was just a side note. I would also be interested in having a conversation about language accessibility in general for our non-English speaking friends and neighbors to be able to participate somehow, some way too. That's not in these bylaws, but I just wanted to flag that for future reference.
A great point.
I will loop you in with John and Merle.
So yeah, as I said, I've got the subcommittee language, and here they are. You know, there might be formatting changes. You know, we'll change a little bit of the language on education. Does anyone have any questions otherwise on this one, section 2?
Now, are these, if I may, the quorum and voting, those are quorum and voting provisions specifically for the subcommittees, right?
I do believe so.
Got it.
I do believe so. Because yeah, it is in there twice. I think again in the Maryland document, that's how they do it. It says committee and not subcommittee versus commission. So I think that maybe that language is being used interchangeably. We can go in and have the word sub be in there so there's consistency. But I do believe that's kind of giving rules for the subcommittee work.
I want to go back to your comment earlier about an executive committee. And we've had one meeting of the subcommittee chairs that worked kind of like an executive committee would. And I'm wondering if we want to enumerate that in the bylaws, or if we just feel comfortable saying that we'll have that group meet on occasion as a group, and we don't need to define that they exist as an entity.
So I'm going to just quickly read from the Maryland document, Article 4 Committee, Section 2, Executive Committee. The Executive Committee shall have at least 3 members consisting of the chair, the vice chair, and 1 or more members to be selected by the chair. The terms of the Executive Committee members shall be concurrent with the term of the chair. The chair shall act as the chair of the Executive Committee. The Executive Committee shall have such duties and perform such functions as may be authorized by the Commission in the administration of the affairs of the Commission. It shall have the express authority to act on behalf of the Commission when such action is required prior to the scheduled meeting of the Commission, or when a quorum of the Commission cannot be formed. The Executive Committee shall maintain a record or minutes of its proceedings and shall report regularly to the Commission.
So
So
I will,
that's like leadership. That's almost sounds like media too. You know, being responsive to things that are in between meetings.
and Melvette has her hand raised, but really quickly, I really like the idea of giving a body that type of that permission, only because in thinking about the vote that Denise wanted to carry out via email, it was for the approvals process for like events that we share on the Commission website. So I think having a smaller body that has permission to approve a document like that makes a lot of sense to me. And I'll let you speak, Melvette, sorry.
No problem. Thanks. I'm glad you finished your thought. I just had a question because I know this occurs on other subcommittees and types of commissions, but we might need to offer clarity or maybe not. So is it true that the subcommittees can only be made up of people who are currently on the commission? Okay.
We were talking about that a little while ago, where advisory members who are non-voting could be added as chosen by the chair of the commission. And they just don't get a vote. The votes are held, I believe, by the governor's recommended folks or required folks.
Got it. Thank you.
But there is a call in the language for us to seek out folks from the community to become involved.
Okay.
So I
sorry
will
to miss
say,
that.
the education subcommittee probably has 3 members of the commission on there and about 27 members of the public. So in a subcommittee like that, where so many of the people participating are external stakeholders, do we feel like they should have a vote? Because that's where we have teachers and museum educators and university professors.
So interesting. So I think that's a really good point. And I think it's a good practice, if allowed by law, that we have as robust participation in a committee as possible by voting and non-voting members of the commission. So then the question is, and I think it is the case, that the work of the committees is advisory to the commission. And that cures a lot, any question, because what that does then is, what the education committee, for instance, is then doing is advising the larger body for the approval of the voting members. That means that they can create a voting structure within their commission, the committee, that includes members of the public. You know, they can do it by acclamation, they can vote by a show of hands, they can do it by majority, because it's non-binding on the commission.
Yeah, I
So
would
should-
agree with that. And there's a section 5 voting at a meeting under Article 3 talks about non-voting members. They shall have no right to vote on any matter brought before the commission and shall serve in an advisory capacity only. And because those members too wouldn't impact a quorum. So even if you had only one person who was, you know, an appointed person, and then the other 27 people there, I wouldn't think that's a legal meeting, because you don't have the other 2 members to meet that quorum. So, but
If there are no binding decisions being made, then it's not that kind of a meeting. But it is advisory to the larger body that is using the advice that it is receiving from these meetings as in order to make binding decisions, and therefore they should still be memorialized. But Jason, you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask, I think that's a really good point, Stephen, with respect to the subcommittees being advisory. Do we need to clarify that in that section? Just, I mean, if we're defining relationships, we need to call that out.
We should. That's exactly right. And maybe we put it at the end of this section 1, Michael.
we can update that. Cindy and I will be sure to update that.
Yeah.
So I have
They,
a follow-up
yeah, go
question.
ahead.
I'm sorry, I have a follow-up question. I might be moving a little slow this afternoon. I need my coffee, my afternoon caffeine shot. I just want to go back to the subcommittee, and I think it was Cindy who was saying that, for example, in the education committee, there were, 20-something folks who were teachers and people, various roles within, I guess, the education field. So in my work for family and civic engagement, Cindy, it made me think, were there parents or families, like everyday folks on the subcommittee? And so that was a thing in my head. And then secondly, also, and just in democratic form and process, wondering if there are votes to be had on the subcommittees, right? Like, so for example, moving forward, like how do you gain consensus and agree that we're all agreeing that this particular thing or item should be then taken to the larger commission? Like, is there voting in that aspect? And I would gently say I encourage that because people want to be a part of the democratic process, right? We're talking about America 250.
Yeah.
Right.
It can, no, that's really great. Committees, I think we should have some statement about, and maybe the way that we do it is we leave it to the discretion of the chair of the subcommittee on how it is that they reach, or maybe we don't, but some committees function best by saying, let's make this unanimous, y'all, because when it comes to education, we all want to be in agree. We want to make unanimous recommendations. While tourism and marketing might say, let's make it, these are subjective things sometimes, marketing, let's make it by vote of a majority. Maybe we leave it to the discretion of the chair of each of the committee. This is just an idea, I'm thinking out loud. But make it very clear that regardless of the voting structure, these are advisory recommendations to the commission, and do not bind the work of the commission.
Got it. Yeah, I like that language.
I think that really gets back to your point from the first meeting, Stephen, in terms of process and modeling these relationships, in Melvet's point about, like, this is really about a democratic process. How can we best incorporate and educate that throughout this document? And I might be getting ahead of myself, but I was also thinking about, do we want to, maybe at the outset that we define our values and our hopes and how we want to frame this document, and why it matters to do it in this way. That might be part of like our responsibility or a promise to Connecticut, that we can state at the outset. I know that may get away a little bit from the formal structure of bylaws, but I think saying that out front, like, this is what this is about, and this is what we seek to do with it.
That's great. I really, really love that, Jason. I don't know whether we have adopted or inherited a mission and vision statement. I think the mission is inherent in the executive order, and the vision is maybe as well. But I love what you're describing as they're kind of like whereas statements, right? And I think that I think it's the type of richness that we were talking about in the very beginning, right? Like stating those values in the beginning of this document, so that we're framing the reason that we're doing this. So that's great. Thank you, Cindy. So if we could wrap in the greater mission and vision of this work as guided by the 250 umbrella, and then put in some whereas based on earlier this conversation, and also just some of the things that were discussed at the last large meeting as well, about that inclusion, about access, about all the other things that we want to accomplish, and about the fact that this is as much about looking back as it is about looking forward. And in fact, if we really look at from the perspective of the framers, it's a lot about looking forward, because that's why we were doing it to begin with. In fact, looking back was the cautionary tale that had us look forward. And I think it resonates to today.
Steve, I totally agree. And I like that idea of Jason, of like almost like this preamble. And I just thought it was so fitting, again, as I mentioned in the last meeting, and I just put into the link, when we look at the original language of the 1965 National Endowments for the Arts Act, and we see the findings of Congress, like right in there's all kinds of really great things that we can lean right into.
Yeah.
And there are those whereas statements that are in Executive Order 22-2 from Governor Lamont, which have a lot of those very similar things, specifically for us, why we're going to celebrate 250. But what I liked in the National Endowment for the Humanities language is it talks about diversity, it talks about cultural heritage, it talks about achievement, it talks about the future, right? And making things widely available and all of these things. And I thought it was very, really inclusive in that, and very with a lot of foresight, considering this is from 1965. And I think it holds true with a lot of it. And it makes perfect sense, as I think the Congress made that, and then that act helped create Connecticut Humanities. And here's Connecticut Humanities through that continuity, stewarding this work and helping the state celebrate it all. So it makes perfect sense to me.
Right. So I think it's an Easter egg hunt, Michael, that you're describing.
The link is, I just sent you the link. It's right there. There's only 12 of them. It's fine. So, yeah, moving on. So we had the enumerated subcommittees there, appointment, all other committee members shall be appointed by the chair. I think those were kind of like, that's just restating those advisory folks, and that it would be Denise who would get to choose them, not necessarily the governor. Forum, I think, again, that references the subcommittee types, those meetings. And then section 6 is the voluntary advisors language expanded a little more, like we were talking about. And I made sure to, again, there's a lot of it's Maryland language, but I included referencing the Connecticut Code of Ethics found in chapter 10 of the Connecticut General Statutes, that it would be applicable for them as far as whatever their behavior is concerned, receiving gifts and otherwise, influence and otherwise. And then moving on beyond that, the almost done section Article 5, finances. I noticed a lot of these other documents kept referencing the fiscal year, so I'm referencing that. Enumerated express language about gifts for the commission to accept, not individuals, but for the commission as a whole to accept. It made sense. I don't know if we have a fiduciary. I don't know if that's Connecticut Humanities, if there's some, I do remember the discussion we had at the meeting, just as a refresher, where we were considering applying for $10,000 in federal funds, but all the strings really didn't give us a lot of the liberty and freedom that we could otherwise perhaps get from acquiring 10,000 elsewhere in other ways. And having this language here regarding gifts should free that ability up. But I wanted, I would leave that to the appointed members to
I think
clarify that. But
what we might do, Michael, is that let's give the commission the same authority, because I think the governor's proclamation is silent on this, right? But I think we can allow for the same authority that our commission has in accepting state, local, federal, philanthropic resources either through gift or donation or development, because there's, to my mind, nothing in the law that precludes that. But I think it's important to say that, because so it's more than just gifts. Gifts will be one of those things, but it's important to say that because and it's easy as a body, any one of the organizations can serve as a fiduciary. In fact, I think probably through your MOU, you have fiduciary capabilities. So and the reason it's important to say that is because when donors are considering their donations, they'll want to see that. They'll want to see that it's something that you're.
And to be clear, again, this language distinguishes the commission receiving something versus individuals. The individuals, the rules are already expressed in the referenced code of ethics. Up to whatever $100 over the course of 12 months or something like that, or 50. There's different things, but where someone's not going to receive diamonds or something like that as an individual versus the commission receiving, maybe something from a municipality or some sort of historical thing to display or something, I don't know.
And that may be where, per the MOU, we articulate that Connecticut Humanities will receive, will accept on behalf of the commission XYZ. State funds will be directed through DECD to then be distributed to Connecticut Humanities per commission and so on.
That's great. Yep.
And then the last section I have here is just something I carried over as boilerplate almost, but as far as amendments go, 2/3 majority.
Yeah,
that's
and
something you want-
the only thing that I would say, and that is pretty, I like that standard in terms of adopting and amending. So let's make sure that, I think that's a good standard, more than a majority, it's a 2/3 of the voting members present at a quorum, because we don't want to limit ourselves either. And then in terms of the limitation, it's inconsistent with the executive order, Connecticut law, Connecticut or federal law. And you might throw in there or the Constitution because that's fun to do. But I think it's implied by it.
I want to stay cognizant of time and it's past 3 o'clock.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. I think we've gone through the document, Cindy, and friends, and I'll leave it to the discretion of the chair here, but I think, going back, Cindy and Michael, you've committed to kind of going back and forth together a little bit and bringing us a document that reflects some of this conversation. And so I think in terms of the bylaws and that particular thing, I think we have our going forwards through the chair.
Yeah. Agreed.
And then one last question, do we want to plan to meet in person or continue virtually on August 21st? Any preferences?
August 21st presents a complexity for Michael and myself, just because we've realized that we're going to be in retreat that day. But that doesn't mean, it's not just us. I mean, we can have all the work ready for the body before then. So I wouldn't. The only thing I would say is, don't count on us necessarily for that day. I did want to just say one more thing. I did ask after speaking with you, Jason, and your email, I did ask David Adams if he would present in our October meeting. And I offered him an abundance of riches, and all he needed was, an extra towel and a warm meal. So he will be in my little colonial home on his way through Connecticut. So it'll come at a very modest cost.
Perfect. Wow, that's wonderful, Stephen.
That
Thanks
is
for
Third
doing that.
Amendment violation of sheltering ordering soldiers. I just want to make sure.
He's definitely a domestic soldier.
They threw a bunch of tea in the harbor over stuff like that. I'm just saying.
That's a very good point, Michael.
Well, thank you all.
That is great. We can, it'd be great if we could meet in person and flexible on adjusting dates. That week could also present problems for me because it's possible that I'm depositing a child in California for college that week. So we'll see.
Okay.
God bless.
Yeah, let's work on a new date since the committee is so small.
It'd be great to see all of you in person too,
Yeah,
if possible.
okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Awesome.
much, Michael and Stephen.
Yeah.
So we will reconnect over email. And then Jason and Cindy, maybe we can set a date for a conversation with the secretary as well.
Yeah, that'd be
Separately.
great.
That would.
And I'll just say, Sydney, I'm available. You can reach out anytime. And if we want to do one last look through together to make sure we captured everything that was just discussed in this meeting, and then maybe send out an updated version for final approval before sending it to the committee, commission as a whole, I'm happy to help with whatever.
That sounds great. And we have time. The commission won't be meeting until October, so
Perfect.
we have some time.
Great, and I'd love to set up, like, maybe carve out a little bit of time, and maybe it is at that next meeting that I won't be at, but maybe either to invite David or at least to kind of frame the conversation as that David will kind of guide with us. And also the structure. We thought modest keynote with a moderated panel would be really, really cool, but and he's open to whatever y'all suggest. So maybe we can spend a little bit of time together giving him some instruction.
That sounds great.
Yep.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
If you ever